Okay, hello again. In this video, I would be talking about the absolute methods of standard setting. The absolute methods of standard setting are essentially the most commonly used ones in education in general. In an exam situation, as discussed previously, you would like the competent students to pass and those who are incompetent to stay behind. And then the question would be, where would you like to place your pass mark? Would it like to be like 50%, or would you like to move it to 60%? And then the question would be, why 50%? Why 60%? So why not 62%, or why not 56%? Probably the most undefensible way would be that you set a score and say, okay, so that's it, so that's my passer score. And believe it or not, that's the most commonly actually used one at the moment. And many of the universities, they do have a pass rate at 50%. So in order to compensate for this, and in order to make that defensible, there have been several methods introduced to education, which you can see a list of them, and these are probably the most famous and most commonly used, and I'll be going through them one by one just to show you how these methods are helping to compensate for different variables which can happen during an examination scenario. For example, an examination which is a bit harder should probably have a pass mark which is slightly lower, and vice versa. Now, to start with, I'm going to start with the Nadelsky method of a standard setting, and this method is essentially based on a number of the distractors a borderline candidate can eliminate. I will just explain that with an example. So just imagine you've got a single best answer or a multiple choice question, and it says in endodontics, which method provides the best tooth isolation? So now remember, again, you have to put yourself in the shoes of a borderline candidate. So that's that just minimally competent student who you're going to allow to go through. So he's not the brightest, he's not average, he's just borderline candidate. And you just have to look at the 5 distractors you've got here and just see how many of them a borderline candidate can possibly eliminate, and for sure be 100% sure that these are not going to be one of the possible answers. So a borderline candidate might have a look at option A, cotton wool roll and gauze. Yeah, they might actually use that for endo isolation. Rubber dam, probably actually they would do that. Retraction cord, probably they can eliminate that distractor. And for the same reason, high volume suction, saliva ejector, probably a borderline candidate can eliminate these distractors as well. So a borderline candidate will be probably choosing between one of these two options. In other words, he's got a chance of 1 out of 2, or 50%, to be able to answer this question correctly. So imagine we've got a paper which has got 5 SBA or MCQ questions, and the first one, the candidate had to choose between one of the 2 possible distractors and was able to eliminate 3 of them. So 1 out of 2, so it's got 0.5, that would be the chance of that question being answered correctly by a borderline candidate. So if you just move on to the second one, for example, the borderline candidate could eliminate 2 of the distractors happily, so then he's got a choice of 1 out of 3 for that single item. And then if you just carry on, just as an example, so in the third one it's got the chance of 1 out of 4, in the fourth one has got the chance of 1 out of 2, and the fifth one has got a chance of 1 out of 3. So if you just then add up all these odds together, you get 1.91, and you had a total of 5 questions, so you can divide 1.91 over 5 and then multiply it by 100 to give you the pass score for that given paper, which in this example is going to be 38%. So The Nadelsky method is an absolute method and just based on the number of distractors. The only problem with the Nadelsky is it only works for the multiple choice question or the single best answer items, and you cannot use it for any other examination or assessment type. So going back to the different other methods which can also be used, and probably the most one of the most famous ones is the Angoff. Now, the Angoff is a variation of the Nadelsky method, and he was trying to, by producing this method, compensate for the fact that Nadelsky can only be used for SBA and MCQ questions. Now, I just want to ask you a very, very difficult question. If I gave you this SBA question and told you, all right then, so tell me a borderline candidate, what's the likelihood of that person answering this question correctly? What would you say from 1 to 100? That's a really, really difficult question, isn't it? So that's actually how the Angoff method works. So if you had an exam paper of, like, 5 items, he would just actually ask a panel of judges to guess what is the likelihood of a borderline candidate to correctly answer each item. So in this example, we said like it was 50% chance of the borderline candidate answering the first item correctly, 80% for the second item, 60% for the third item, and just go on. So, and then the same applies as the Nadelsky. So just sum up all the odds and then divide it and then multiply it by 100. And the good thing about the Angoff method was then you can actually use it for any type of exam. So it's not necessarily MCQs or SBAs, because you're just guessing the odds of a borderline candidate being able to answer. The problem is, it's very difficult to judge, because how good of a judge should you be in order to be able to even correctly, or even close to being correct, guess what is the likelihood of answering a question correctly. So for that reason, people actually made some modifications to the Angoff method to make it work a little bit better. So the modified Angoff, which is extremely commonly used, and we use it here at the School of Dentistry as well, works on the basis of the likelihood of the number of marks which a borderline candidate can gain out of the total marks of pretty much every single item of a question. So say, for example, if instead of that example which I showed you one single question and asked you what's the likelihood of borderline candidate being able to answer correctly, if I told you we've got an MCQ paper of 5 items. Now, out of these 5 items, how many items do you think a borderline candidate can answer correctly? So that's a very different approach now. And then you will have a look at all the 5 items and just say, oh, well, yeah, so the first one, they can probably answer. The second one, no, they can't. Third one, yes. Fourth one, yes. Fifth one, no. So then, 3 out of 5 can be answered by a borderline candidate, and then the pass mark would be 60%. That's how you set your 60%. So if this is actually, if you look at the paper of 5 items of MCQ, you can, however, implement this to the other examination or assessment types. For example, here is a short answer question item, and let's have a look at this. So you're about to start a root canal treatment for a lower left 5. Now, mention 5 methods that can be used to isolate the tooth. How many root canals does this tooth have, and what is your estimated working length based on average data available? Now, each of these items, they've got marks individually, and then you as a judge, you might have a look and say, well, a borderline candidate, probably out of 5 methods, they can at least actually mention 3 of them. And then for the second item, a borderline candidate probably actually can answer that one, and then the last item, you don't think so. And remember, you always have to bear in mind at what year you're looking at. And say, for example, we are giving this example for a 5th year dental student. So if we just now add all the marks which we thought a borderline candidate can gain from this item. It's going to be 3 plus 1 is going to be 4, so it's 4 out of 8 a borderline candidate possibly actually can get of this. So if we had 5 questions in our short answer question paper, and the first item has got a total mark of 8, and second one has got 12, and so on. And then in the first one, a borderline candidate you expect that's going to get 4 out of 8, and then 8 out of 12 for the second one, and so on. All you have to do then is just to add up what you think a borderline candidate can get. In this example, it's 25, and then you divide it by the total mark possible for that paper, which is 15 here, and you just calculate the percentage. In this example, just happened to be 50%. So the pass mark for this paper is going to be 50%. So that's how the modified ANGOF works. And because it's a bit more flexible and it's a bit more logical, it can be actually applied to a variety of exam methods, but not to all of them. So here we've got another method called Ebell, which is also a very, very commonly used method, and it works based on the item importance and also item difficulty. Now, the way it works is, in terms of item difficulty, they would divide a question into one of these 3 categories. So a question could be hard, which means a borderline candidate would not be able to, or cannot answer. It could be moderate, if a borderline candidate may or may not answer that, and easy, if a borderline candidate can answer that. And in terms of item importance, it can be again subdivided into 3 categories. So now, in terms of importance, you have to again bear in mind that you are looking at safe beginners. If you're not familiar with this terminology, please look at the video which is first in the series to talk about the GDC guidelines. But essentially, if you think in terms of importance an item is essential, it means that a competent candidate needs to know about this. If it's important, it means that generally it's an important item to ensure competency, but it's not necessary, and still they can do dentistry safely. And if it's supplementary, it means that it really doesn't affect competency, and you will actually know a little bit better if I show you some examples. Sometimes when people are doing the Ebell method, they've got a 4th category, and they call it questionable, which they cannot really put a question in any of these. But for the sake of simplicity, I'm just actually looking at these 3 rather than the 4 option one. So let's have a look for some to some examples. Just imagine you would like to look at this simple question and say in terms of importance or item importance, whereabouts you would like to put it as a judge. So what is the gold standard of tooth isolation in endodontics? You probably actually in your mind something just shouting it's going to be rubber dam, it's going to be rubber dam. Now, is this essential knowledge? So does a competent dentist as a safe beginner needs to know this? Is it important or is it supplementary? You're probably actually between essential and important, and this is why you need really actually a panel of judges. I myself, as a single judge, I would just say this is an essential item. A borderline candidate, a safe beginner, needs to know what is a gold standard for tooth isolation in endodontics. But you might argue that, and then if you've got a panel of judges, then we can actually just discuss this and come into a conclusion. Let's have a look at this item. How many root canals does a lower second premolar have? Is this essential? Is it important or supplementary? Now, so if a dental student who I let through to graduate, and if he or she doesn't know how many root canals does a lower second premolar have, does it make him incompetent? Probably he would end up removing a little bit more tooth tissue, so it's not great, but it's not really actually a safety issue. So you may again argue between essential and important. I personally would put that in an important item, but it's not essential, if that makes sense. But again, you can argue and then decide. Now let's have a look at this item. So what is the water content of root dentin vital tooth? So is it essential, is it important, or is it supplementary? So if you as a dentist, you don't know what is the water content in the root dentin, then would you become unsafe? Probably not. So you can say this is probably a supplementary category rather than essential or important. Now let's look at item difficulty and see what you are going to mention about this item. So same question. Would you put this as hard? Would you put it as moderate or easy? I think when it comes to item difficulty, one of the things you have to bear in mind is whereabouts are they in terms of their training and how frequently and how recently they have been exposed to that piece of knowledge. So say if this is a question asked to third-year students that they've never been exposed to this, it could be a hard item or it could be a moderate item. But if this is like fifth-year students and they had a symposium and there was a lot of emphasis on this particular piece of knowledge, then you might actually rank it slightly differently. Let's have a look at another item. So how many root canals does a lower second premolar have? Again, if you ask a first-year dental student, it might be a moderate or even a hard question if they have not been exposed to this piece of knowledge yet. However, if you ask a third-year dental student, it becomes easy or moderate, and for a fifth-year student, probably it's going to be an easy item to answer. So when you go through all your questions in a given paper, then you write a matrix or draw a matrix with these factors. So you've got the hard, moderate, and easy on one side, and you've got essential, important, and supplementary on the other side. So let's, for a sake of simplicity and example, we pick an MCQ paper with 100 questions in that, and then after you go through each item, you say, for example, 5 of the items were hard and essential, 12 were moderate and essential, 13 were easy and essential, and so on for the rest of the items. And then, as a panel of judges, you have to sit down and say, okay then, so let's redraw this matrix, you ignore what you actually just written down, and then as a borderline candidate, what is the likelihood of a borderline candidate answering a hard essential question correctly, and what's the likelihood of a borderline candidate answering a moderate and essential question, and so on. So as a panel of judges, you come up with these percentages and numbers, and I just put these percentages as an example, and I don't think they're like too far from reality. So borderline candidates in their 5th year, for instance, essential but hard items, probably they've got 70% likelihood of answering those correctly, whilst a supplementary and hard, only like 20%, if not even actually 0. So as a panel of judges, you sit down and you come to an agreement on this matrix. And then all you have to do is you have to multiply each of those items by those percentages to get the likelihood of each part of your matrix to be answered correctly by a borderline candidate. So I've done the calculation for you, and all you have to do is just to add all these numbers together to give you the final pass mark for that exam paper, which just happened to be 63% for this 100 item MCQ or SBA paper. So here we had a quick chat about the Nadalski method, Angoff and modified Angoff and Ebell, and they were all within the category of absolute standard setting methods. In the next video, I would be talking about the relative methods, so I will see you very, very shortly.